Want to welcome everybody to the July briefing from RUBI, the Rural Urban Bridge Initiative. I know a number of you are regulars who have attended many of our past briefings, and I'm sure some of you are new to this, and this is your first briefing. We're very excited today to have as our guest and our presenter, Stacy Mitchell. Stacy is a friend and colleague of the past more than 2 decades for me, and she is the co-executive director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. It's a national organization that works on a lot of different dimensions, from new technologies, sustainable technologies, through to practical training and tools provided to local communities, and to big picture policy questions, working on all of them to create stronger, more self-reliant communities, economies, and a nation. And Stacy has been with ILSR for many years now. She is also the author of a wonderful book called Big Box Swindle, which looks very deeply at all of the advantages given to major corporations that provide them a leg up, often at taxpayers' expense, vis-a-vis local businesses. Stacy and I first started working together actually because in little old Abingdon, Virginia, we were fighting a Walmart coming to town, and we utilized Stacy's expertise and the resources of ILSR to basically put up a fight that was successful in keeping Walmart out of Abingdon 20 plus years ago. So today, Stacy and I are going to do something a little bit different. This was her suggestion, and I'm excited about it. Rather than Stacy doing her presentation for 25 to 30-ish minutes, instead, Stacy and I are going to be in a conversation for 25 to 30 minutes to bring out the information that she thinks is most pertinent to this topic. And then, as always, we will switch gears and open it up to the floor to all of you for questions and comments for the second half of the hour. So thanks so much. And first off, Stacy, thanks so much for joining us here at the Rural Urban Bridge Initiative.
It's so nice to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Great, great. By the way, I'll put a little plug in. Stacy was on my podcast a week or two ago, and if you look for the podcast, you'll be able to listen to that conversation as well. So let's begin, Stacy, with just talking about our economy, the US economy, and just how concentrated has it become? And what are the effects of that extreme concentration of putting so much of the economy into the hands of very few large corporations, especially the effects in rural areas?
We have seen just extreme and unprecedented levels of corporate concentration. Corporate concentration has been growing for a few decades now and has just reached, as I said, a really extreme level kind of across the economy. We know from academic research that more than 75% of sectors have grown markedly more concentrated. And when you begin to look in one industry after another, you see very few corporations have extraordinary control. So we see this in the food sector where, in terms of supermarkets, we have 5 companies that capture half of all food spending in the US. Walmart alone, 1 out of every $4 that Americans spend on groceries, much higher levels of concentration in many regions of the country. And within food processing, we also have extraordinary concentration. You go into the grocery store and you see all of those brands on the store shelves, and it seems like a lot of diversity, but in fact, there are just a handful of big companies that own the vast majority of brands that you see, companies like General Mills and ConAgra. We have 4 giant meat packing operations that control 85% of all beef processing in the US. The same is true with beer. We've got 3 companies that make 3/4 of the beer that Americans drink. Airlines is another industry where we've got extreme concentration, a handful of big airlines that dominate the market nationally. If you live in a small city, you know very well that you may have only one choice on any given route, if that, in terms of flying these days. It didn't used to be this way. Telecommunications, there are two companies that really dominate access to the internet. Many Americans have at most only one provider of broadband, if that. I could just go on and on. There are many examples in the healthcare industry where we've seen massive consolidation among insurers, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, and so on, really up and down and throughout the healthcare field. And then, just to layer one more layer to just a description of what's going on, we now have these big tech companies that not only, and I'm talking about Google, Facebook, Amazon, they not only dominate particular markets, but they essentially own and control the underlying infrastructure that all these other companies have to use. And so they are sort of monopolists of an even greater level than we see in other parts of the economy. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. The effects of this concentration, there are really three broad effects, all of which have become quite severe in recent years. One is that this is a major driver of the concentration of wealth and income. The fact that we have a small number of Americans who control most of the wealth and most of the income, and lots of people who are struggling to get by. That is a direct consequence of concentration. We know, for example, from academic research that the more concentrated an industry is, the more that the top companies are able to hold down wages. And so indeed, wage inequality is largely a function of concentration, economists have determined in recent studies. We've also lost lots of small businesses. So another pathway to the middle class, small businesses that have been driven out of the market by monopolistic tactics of these big companies. So those are the kinds of things that are driving the extreme inequality. The second thing that is a big consequence of concentration is that it's really killing innovation and it's making our economy fragile. I mean, we had a sort of front row terrifying seat for this during the worst of the pandemic, when we actually had supermarket shelves that didn't have meat, because it turns out we've got this handful of meat processors. If one of their plants goes down, well, suddenly we're actually lacking meat. Or we saw it also with semiconductors and chips and other things that are made by just a few very a small number of corporations. So our economy has become less dynamic, more fragile, more at risk of shortages and just dysfunction in general, because we lack the kind of diversity that we need. And the last thing is that all of this has an effect on democracy. When you concentrate economic power, it inevitably means a concentration of political power, and the loss of agency and community self-determination that has gone along with this trend has also really undermined and weakened democracy and weakened faith in democracy. And lastly, just to sort of underscore a couple of the effects for rural areas in particular, one effect is that as the economy has grown more concentrated, that means that prosperity has grown more concentrated in a geographic sense. So one example of this is Amazon. You've got Amazon creating fairly high-paying jobs in a couple of places: Seattle, where it has its original headquarters; Washington, D.C., where it has its second headquarters. And at the same time, destroying a lot of the businesses that provide jobs and economic activity in all the other regions of the country. At best, what a rural community might hope for from Amazon are these very low-wage warehouse jobs, and a huge loss of local businesses. So the extreme disparities that we see geographically, and particularly the struggles that rural areas are having, are also a direct result of concentration. We see a growing number of places that are deserts: hospital deserts, pharmacy deserts, food deserts. That's all a function of concentration, and rural areas especially hard hit. And then the extraction that we see from big ag and these other consolidated companies, the airlines charging more in smaller cities, the big ag companies squeezing farmers. All of that is effectively taking money out of rural America and concentrating it in the hands of a few corporations.
So you've made a real strong argument that there's a lot of downsides to this concentration, but isn't it the case that we have these enormous corporations because they're just so good at what they do, that they're just more efficient than the little guys, and they deliver the goods and services better, quicker, more effectively, and they're the innovators. Don't they drive innovation? So will you comment on that? Aren't the big because they're just so good at it?
Yeah, and that has been exactly the idea that we've been living under for a long time, and what has really justified the policy changes that led to all of this concentration. But my organization and others have been doing really careful research looking at this question, and we have found time and time again that smaller businesses actually outcompete in certain ways, and that they deliver distinct benefits for consumers and for their markets that larger companies can't provide. That is that small businesses have a really important role to play in markets, and that there are, as I said, ways in which they outcompete. So one area that we see this in is with pharmacies. We know from consumer reports and a lot of other data that independent pharmacies have lower prices on prescriptions, that they provide much better healthcare in terms of consulting with patients and providing free screenings and the like. And that they generate a lot of benefits for their local economies. They in fact outcompete CVS, they outcompete the Walmart pharmacies on both price and service and the quality of what they do. They are losing ground. How is that possible if they're outcompeting? And the answer has to do with the market power abuses of companies called pharmacy benefit managers. And I don't want to get too far down the road of describing what these companies do, but the largest of these companies is CVS. So CVS not only competes with local pharmacies, but they are a major pharmacy benefit management company, meaning they get to determine which drugs, which pharmacies are approved by your insurance, and the reimbursement rates that those pharmacies get when they fill your prescriptions. So not surprisingly, given that inherent conflict of interest, what we've seen is that CVS and other big PBMs have been slashing reimbursement rates to independent pharmacies and in various ways trying to steer customers to their pharmacies and away from the independents. So independents are losing not because they can't compete, but in fact they outcompete. They're being run out of the market by really problematic anti-competitive market structures that have been set up. That same story is going on in sector after sector after sector. We see Anheuser-Busch, major beer company, squeezing out craft brewers in many markets by going into deals with distributors or even buying distributors where the arrangement is you're going to put Anheuser-Busch's labels and our craft beers on supermarket shelves, and meanwhile, you're not going to put these small competitors on supermarket shelves. That's our deal with you as a distributor. There are examples in other sectors. We know, for example, that the fastest broadband speeds in the country are provided by small, often community-owned broadband networks, not by the major players. We know that community banks, local banks, actually have lower costs, lower fees for consumers, and provide far more of the kinds of job-supporting small business and community development loans that we need than the big banks do. So again and again, what we see is that small entities actually provide really important part of our economy, outcompete in many ways, provide really distinct benefits in their various markets, and that the story of, well, we're nostalgic, we miss them, that's warm and fuzzy, but at the end of the day, they can't compete. That is a story that's been told to cover up the series of policy decisions that really have led us to where we are.
And what role, just as a quick follow-up, what role do state and federal subsidies play in, again, giving the big boys advantages that the small don't tend to have?
I mean, it's extraordinary. State and local governments, as communities have been really hurting for economic development, in part because of the effects of consolidation, one of the responses from state and local governments has been, well, we've got to go out and lure these big companies, and we're going to provide them huge subsidies and huge tax breaks. Estimates suggest that state and local governments spend more than $90 billion a year in various subsidies, and that almost all of those dollars go to the largest corporations. And you see this time and time again, where you've got, I just read a news story earlier this morning about a community in, I believe it's Illinois, that was subsidizing a Dollar General. offering a big tax break to Dollar General. Meanwhile, the local grocers and other businesses that compete with Dollar General, they're not getting those kinds of subsidies. And so it's a direct, it's a way that government is tilting the playing field. And we see this in tax policy, and particularly we also see this in the ways in which we weakened our antitrust laws 40 years ago. Back in the 70s and the 80s, there was this idea that before we had thought about, okay, we need to maintain a level playing field, ensure that businesses of all sizes have a fair chance to compete, and that's what's going to best deliver in terms of protecting the interests of consumers and communities and democracy. And in the 70s and 80s, we changed course. We decided that bigger was better no matter what, that large scale was the thing that was going to deliver, that bigger was going to deliver low prices, and all of those, that set of ideas really captured both the right and Democrats as well in the 70s and 80s. And we systematically stopped enforcing, and in other ways weakened our antitrust laws, which has been a major reason that we've gotten into the mess that we are today. But there's a whole set of state and local tax policies, subsidy policies, even zoning and land use, that because of that ideology, that assumption about big business is going to be good, has in fact systematically worked to tilt this playing field in favor of the biggest corporations.
It's become something of a self-reinforcing prophecy at some point when you've denuded local communities of a local business base, and then you lift up the big corporations and subsidize them. It's at some point there's nothing left but them in some places. So let me ask you about a couple in particular. When most folks think, including myself, when we think of the big corporations that have pushed out a lot of small players, Walmart comes to mind. You already mentioned that Walmart alone has 1/4 of the grocery market in the country, which is extraordinary. But it isn't just Walmart. Your research, especially the last few years, has looked really closely at the dollar stores and at Amazon. So I want you to talk a little bit about both of them. Just how big have the dollar stores gotten, and how fast are they growing? And then Amazon, in a different way, also becoming so dominant. Tell us about both of those.
Yeah, I mean, the dollar stores, so we're talking about Dollar Tree and Dollar General. Dollar Tree owns Family Dollar, so there are three big brands, two companies behind them. And they are multiplying at an extraordinary rate. Almost half of all new store openings, new retail store openings over the last couple of years have been the dollar chains, almost half. It's just unprecedented. And, there are certainly situations where these chains fill a legitimate need, where there really is no retail, but often because of Walmart and what's been left in the wake of Walmart. But what we found in doing a sort of close study of the dollar chains and their impacts is that they are not merely a symptom or a byproduct of economic distress. They're actually a cause of it. That these chains come into communities and that they undermine the local economy. They drive existing businesses, particularly grocers, out. They offer fewer jobs than they displace. And they, in various ways, tend to undermine the overall economic prospects of a place. We also found that they deliberately target certain kinds of communities. They target rural towns, very small towns in rural areas, and they target communities of color in both urban places and in rural places. And that's controlling for income, controlling for other things. They deliberately go after, locate stores in communities of color. We see in both rural areas and urban areas that they often blanket a neighborhood or a region with lots and lots of stores. And in fact, if you think the dollar chains are already here, already done what they're going to do, keep in mind that these companies currently have about 34,000 locations, and they intend to grow to 51,000 in the next few years. So they have many, many more stores coming. And their strategy is to blanket regions with multiple stores so that they effectively drive out competing businesses, particularly competing grocers. They want to be the only game in town. They thrive in food deserts, and where a food desert doesn't exist, they work to create them, and they often succeed. We found that one of the ways that they succeed is really by using a set of predatory tactics and anti-competitive tactics. They take advantage of some of the laxness in our antitrust enforcement, and particularly the fact that we don't enforce a law that deals with predatory buying. And we can talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's a really important thing that's going on, particularly for rural communities to be aware of, because there's some interest in reviving that enforcement and would make a big difference in terms of the grocery issue. But these chains, the dollar chains, they use these predatory tactics. And so what we've seen over the last few years, and we've documented, we did a report that came out earlier this year that goes through, I put a link in the chat, that goes through kind of the effects of these stores, what we've learned about them, and really lays out this case, and also looks at the fact that we've had over 50 communities, both small towns and big cities, place limits on dollar stores in the last few years. There is a growing uprising and resistance to these stores. And what we're working on now, we've been in touch and advising a lot of those communities on how to do that. We have a strategy guide and a whole set of resources to help communities struggling with dollar stores. We are now also working with those communities to push federal antitrust enforcers to insist on a level playing field for the dollar chains. And then to switch gears a little bit and take on Amazon, which, there is really no corporation that has as an extensive grip on our economy right now as Amazon. There's no corporation that has as much power within the US or even globally as Amazon. Amazon, historically, we've sort of thought of Amazon as a retailer, but that's not really quite the right way to think about Amazon. Amazon is really an infrastructure provider. Amazon dominates a number of the sort of primary infrastructure that the modern economy runs on. So in the case of online shopping, Amazon's marketplace, its platform for sales, captures about half of all online spending in the US. And most importantly, about 2/3 of Americans, when they want to buy something online, they start at Amazon. It used to be that someone went to a search engine and they would type in, running shoes or Barbie doll or whatever it is that they were looking to buy, and they would get a list of results that would include Amazon, would include other companies, including maybe a local toy store or local running shoe store. Today, most Americans, the vast majority, start their shopping right on Amazon. They go straight to Amazon, they type in what they want. And what that means is if you're a business that makes or sells anything and you want to reach people online, which of course you need to, you have two options. You can either sell on Amazon, which means that you are now selling on a platform that's run by your biggest competitor. They will spy on you. They will steal your best products, ideas. They will demote you in the search result and put their own versions ahead. And they will charge you extraordinary fees. Amazon is now in the US taking an estimated 50% of every dollar that businesses selling on its site make. So you can either sell on Amazon and be fleeced and otherwise preyed upon, or you can not sell on Amazon and hang your shingle out, open your own website, but it's like hanging your shingle out on a dirt road because nobody's out there. Everybody's starting on Amazon, and so there's no traffic for you to pick up. And so this is essentially a monopoly that Amazon has in online commerce, and is having huge negative effects, squeezing and undermining not only independent retailers but small and mid-sized product companies of all kinds. Amazon similarly has control over other big pieces of infrastructure. The cloud is another example where they control 40% of the world's cloud computing capacity. They are by far the number one. And of course, every company, lots of governments, they now not only store their data, but they do their computing in the cloud. They use applications that are in the cloud. That means there's a whole slew of companies and governments, Defense Department, and so on, that have to ride Amazon's rails in the cloud in order to do business. So this control of infrastructure, the online market, the cloud, there are other examples that Amazon controls. It not only gives them this power to essentially regulate our economy, to decide which companies are going to get on the first page of search results and thus succeed, and which are going to fail because they're on page 10. It gives them the ability to essentially tax the trade of other corporations, other companies, small businesses, mid-sized businesses, through the fees that it charges to access those rail lines, right? It's an extraordinary, almost quasi-government-like power, right? The power to regulate, the power to determine how a market operates, but not really a market. It's a private arena controlled by Amazon. That to me is a really direct threat to all of our values as Americans, and the notion of free and open markets, the notion of public spaces where there's a set of rules that are publicly determined and not a set of rules determined by a private actor.
Right. It's extraordinary, the power. I was trying to buy a ricer to mash potatoes the other day because I wanted to make gnocchi. And I did not go to Amazon. I just went to the search engine, and still the first 6 options were all Amazon. I had to scroll and scroll and scroll before I could find an alternative. So we're almost at the halfway point. There's still 2 critical questions I want to get to. I'm going to ask you to be as brief as you can. The first relates to policy, broadly speaking, kind of a twofold question. First of all, what kinds of policies work to begin to unwind this concentration? And is the current administration federally doing any of that? Is the Biden administration working to tackle concentration? Then after you answer that, I want to get to kind of the political question, the ideological question that connects to the divide. But first, tell us about good policy, and are we getting any of it?
Yeah, so let me take sort of the legislative piece first, and then I want to spend most of my time just talking a little bit about the Biden administration. So on the sort of state, local, federal legislative front, we touched a little bit on, the ways in which local and state tax policy, subsidies, even land use skew the playing field. So there's a lot of opportunity to level the playing field. There's a lot of power in local and state government. And we developed actually a policy guide for state and local anti-monopoly policies. So we've got a whole set of examples across lots of different sectors of the economy. We talked a little bit about PBMs, the pharmacy benefit managers, and that whole issue. States are actually out in front on that issue. We've got states who are mandating transparency, who are using Medicaid plans to push back against CVS, who are insisting that independent pharmacies be treated fairly. There's lots of great examples of that. So we've got a whole set of resources, and I can share the link to that guide for people to look at in terms of state and local. I would also just note that state antitrust, state attorneys general have jurisdiction over our federal antitrust laws. So states are empowered to enforce those laws, and we are watching very closely. There are some really good AGs out there who are really have been at the lead of saying, hey, we have allowed a set of anti-competitive practices to take hold. We've got monopolies, and we actually need to dust off and use these laws. In terms of the Biden administration, as I mentioned briefly, we had this kind of coup, this transformation that happened about 40 years ago. And, the things that are important to know about that is, one, that the United States has incredibly strong antitrust laws. We wrote those laws between the 1890s and about 1950. They're amazingly strong. They're very clear in that their purpose is to decentralize power, to support small businesses and communities. There's no question what those laws say. They are all still on the books. None of them have been repealed. What happened 40 years ago is that the enforcement agencies and to some degree the courts decided we're going to reinterpret these laws and decide that instead of meaning what they say they mean and what Congress meant when they passed them, we've decided that they're all going to be about maximizing efficiency and nothing else. The democratic concerns, the local economy concerns, everything that infused what Congress did, we're going to pretend like that didn't exist. And we're just going to say, if we think this merger is going to maximize efficiency, we're going to say yes. If we can't see any real harm to concentration, I mean, basically they adopted a bigger is better attitude about enforcement. And so what's happening right now, and this continued all the way through Obama.
When you say maximize efficiency, in a lot of respects, that comes down to that means they'll charge lower prices for the products. Is that basically it?
Yeah, I mean, so Bork, who you may recall as the failed Supreme Court nominee, was really the architect of this and a set of thinkers associated with the University of Chicago. It's often referred to as the Chicago School of Thought. And Bork's idea was maximizing efficiency. Like if corporations could do things for less, he was not terribly concerned with who benefited. But there was a kind of gloss that was put on more by Democrats, frankly, who came along and said, well, the beneficiaries here, if it's consumers, if we can get to low prices, then that's good. And so it has become really a price theory. If we can show that a merger will reduce prices in the short term, then you'll let it go through. Now, there's been a lot of work that's now been done, retrospectives of mergers, for example, where you go back and study the mergers they approved. Turns out those predictions were wrong, that most of the time prices actually went up. And then workers were hurt, businesses were hurt, local economies were hurt. And so we didn't even actually get the consumer benefits that were supposedly promised of all of this. That's sort of where we've arrived today. And there's been a lot of scholarship and work in the last few years really unpacking the consequences of that set of decisions. And as I said, it's kind of a coup because Congress didn't repeal the laws. Congress didn't change anything. It was really carried out by the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, the two antitrust agencies. This continued all the way through Obama, through Trump, this way of thinking. Biden came along and in 2021, shortly after taking office, he gave this major speech in which he said, we have gone through we are 40 years into an experiment of letting giant corporations accumulate more and more power. And what have we gotten from it? Too many Americans have been left behind. He said, I believe this experiment has failed. So he repudiated this absolutely in complete terms. And he went about appointing to lead the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice some of the leading thinkers on anti-monopoly, some of our close allies, people who've really been at the forefront of calling this out. And we're now seeing that those agencies are dusting off the laws, picking up the powers that they have, and working to actually address this problem. It's one of the most hopeful things that's going on in government right now. And what I want to sort of underscore, and I know we're close on time, is that a lot of the problems that we're all working on at the local level, whether it's dealing with the lack of grocery stores and food deserts, inequality, the dysfunction and despair in our political system, a whole host of things, all that work at the local level, all those efforts would be so much easier to achieve what we're trying to achieve if we weren't fighting this uphill fight, because the antitrust laws are the way they're enforced right now is pushing back down against us and pushing back down against those solutions. And so if we can all work to shift this at the federal level, it changes the landscape of everything that we're really working on.
That's great. So maybe this will come out more in the Q&A. Whatever its faults, and they certainly are faults in the Biden administration, antitrust is enforcing it is one of the real strong suits, and that could have long-lasting positive benefits for rural and all over. Let's wrap up our part of the conversation and then open it up to questions with one last critical question. I've heard you say, and I think I even saw it in writing, that you believe the left, broadly speaking, liberals, progressives, Democrats, have really missed the boat when it comes to small businesses. Now, this is obviously related to the antitrust question, but I believe that I understood you to say that small businesses could and should be a natural part of the coalition of liberals and progressives, but they haven't been because, not because they haven't wanted to be, but because on our side, we've simply pushed them away. I don't know if I'm characterizing that correctly, but I want you to comment on that and how you see local businesses, diverse independent businesses fitting in to a coalition that also includes workers and unions and many other elements of that.
Yeah, I mean, in this period, this really transformative period in the late 70s and the early 80s, we prior to that period, from the New Deal, when our during the 1930s, when FDR really put our antitrust laws into full force, and Congress went on to pass additional ones in the subsequent years. Also did labor law back then, obviously in the 30s. From that period, from the 30s through the 70s, is a period where there was a broad consensus, certainly among Democrats, also to some degree among conservatives, around the need to check corporate power. And the Democratic Party, I would argue, won majorities in Congress for much of that period on the strength of this anti-monopoly policymaking and the fact that that was built on a coalition that was made up of farmers, small businesses, and organized labor. And it sounds strange to us today, but organized labor and small business groups were close allies. They were the core of the Democratic Party and strong allies because they were seen at that time and they understood themselves to be really two sides of the same coin. That if the goal of government and a democracy is to check concentrations of power and ensure that ordinary people have an opportunity to have a fair say over their livelihoods and a fair piece of the pie, then being in a union or starting your own business are two ways to do that. And so these were understood to be very aligned and very integrated. That all came apart in the 70s and 80s, and the sort of ascendant part of the Democratic Party that went along with this Borkian antitrust thinking, the folks that eventually triumphed within the Democratic Party, they very much abandoned small business. They decided that bigger corporations were going to deliver more for consumers, were going to be more better in other ways, generate more prosperity. And they really stepped away from antitrust. They stepped away from strong banking laws that kept capital flowing to local communities and to local businesses. They basically abandoned small business. And Reagan and the US Chamber of Commerce recognized that opportunity and they started talking small business and they claimed that mantle for themselves quite effectively. And so now the very encouraging thing that we're seeing is now that anti-monopoly is back on the table in terms of what Democrats are talking about, and as there's this focus on concentrated power, we've seen that alliance between small business and labor start to come back. And we have leading folks within progressive politicians who are talking a lot more about small business than they used to. And we're seeing, particularly around Amazon, small business groups and labor folks teaming up really to challenge this company's power.
Great, thank you. Wonderful. So that's just an enormous amount of information and a lot of hopeful stuff too, I'm glad to say. Oftentimes it's sort of mostly the dismal and the dire. So this is great. We have a question in the chat and then Beth has her hand raised. I'm going to read the chat question first and then go to Beth's question after that. The chat question comes from David. He asks about poultry farmers and how they are at the mercy of the big corporations, the integrators, because sometimes if they complain about low prices or anything else, they'll be demoted, they'll be cut off from shipments of new birds. The contracts are structured to put the poultry contract producers at an incredible disadvantage. Is there anything that can be done locally or otherwise to challenge this?
Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right. I mean, the contract growing system, so, poultry farmers, they basically work under these contracts where they're hardly independent. The poultry processor, Tyson, et cetera, sets all the terms, makes them, tells them where they buy their chicks, their equipment, everything else, and often is engaged in these reverse auctions. So where they're paid, what the farmers are ultimately paid is determined through a reverse auction, with them essentially having to, bid against other farmers for the lowest price to be paid. I mean, it's really an egregious system that is designed to exploit and rip people off in the worst way. This has been written about beautifully by a number of folks, and farmers have certainly been speaking out on it. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, has a number of tools that this is one of the areas where I think Biden has sort of pushed this whole of government approach, like we need all the agencies addressing concentration. I don't really feel like personally the USDA has gotten that message, and I'm pretty upset with the secretary. I do think that they have tools like the Packers and Stockyards Act and other tools that they should be using much more aggressively, because clearly, whether you're a poultry farmer, beef farmer, certainly in all of livestock and in a lot of the crops as well, you've got processing companies that have just ridiculous control and engage in practices that are abusive.
So let's go to Beth's question. Beth, you can come off mute and ask your question.
Hi, it was interesting to hear about the all the laws and effect of anti-monopoly laws. My main concern is even with so many laws that are on the books, you still have too much influence from the corporations, the different administrations, be they Republican or Democratic, put into place people, the heads of the different agencies who are from corporations. So they're doing the work of the corporations in the government. And I think that's a big issue for me. I think it's a big issue why this government doesn't represent enough of the working people, and they always seem to be representing the corporations and doing the corporations' bidding. And I'd like you to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, you're 100% right. We see this revolving door across government, and it is one of the consequences of this incredible level of corporate power, right? That the kind of economic power, the financial power these companies have inevitably bleeds into government, and they write the laws, and they have a revolving door with who staffs the agencies and who staffs Congress, the lobbying, everything else. That said, I do want to just really underscore the distinction that the moment that we're in right now and the incredible opportunity we have to kind of seize it. So we now have the Federal Trade Commission, which is an independent agency that is charged with enforcing our antitrust laws and also broadly with enforcing against unfair methods of competition. That's the legal language, and also with protecting consumers from fraud and other kinds of things. It's an agency that has been given a lot of tools, a lot of authority, a lot of responsibility to go after exactly the kinds of problems we're talking about. That agency, for all the many years I can remember, is exactly what you're talking about. Like it's run by a commission, 5 commissioners, one of whom is the chair. The chair has a lot of additional authority. And those commissioners have often been people who come from, big law, where they defended corporations, other walks of life where, they had been working on behalf of the powerful for a lot of their careers. And now they're supposedly, in charge of, looking out for us, right? Right now, we have a set of commissioners for whom that is not the case. The Federal Trade Commission is chaired by a woman named Lena Khan, who comes out of academia, has been a leading person in terms of documenting and illustrating what went wrong with this lack of antitrust enforcement. She has been at the forefront of the anti-monopoly movement, and she is now the chair and has been for the last 2 years of the Federal Trade Commission. The other commissioners who are with her are similarly like-minded. And some of the things that they are doing, they've proposed a ban on non-competes, which would be huge. They are working on revising.
Can you explain what that means?
Yeah. So you might be familiar with this idea of in an employment contract, you might be asked to sign a non-compete saying that, yes, when you take a job with someone, you're saying, okay, if I leave this job, I won't go work for a competitor for a year, maybe, or 2 years after I leave this job. Non-competes are widespread. Huge numbers of American workers are subject to them. And you might think, oh, it's just like highly paid, highly skilled, scientists or tech people and the like. Not at all. Huge numbers of fast food workers, low-wage workers sign non-competes, meaning you're working for McDonald's and you can't quit that job and take another job at a different fast food restaurant in your community because you're bound by this non-compete. It's like the poultry stuff we were talking about. It's a way through a contract to control someone that you shouldn't be allowed to do. The Federal Trade Commission has proposed and is working on a rule that would ban non-competes. It would be a huge thing for American workers, but also for small businesses, because those agreements prevent people from going out and starting a business. They prevent new businesses from hiring the best talent. So again, these are tools for the most powerful to retain and expand their power. This Federal Trade Commission is moving to just ban them completely. The Federal Trade Commission is also about to release new merger guidelines, which I know sounds like it's deep in the weeds of policy, and in some sense it is, but the merger guidelines, a key way, when I talked about that change that happened in the late 70s and the early 80s, it was really implemented in the early years of the Reagan administration. And a major way that it was implemented was through the merger guidelines of the time, where basically they wrote new guidelines about mergers that said, you know, we're going to let a lot of these mergers through. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what the guidelines did under Reagan. Those have held basically more or less unchanged all these years. We've got an FTC that's going to change those. That's going to have a huge impact in a lot of different ways, not only with regard to mergers, but how the courts interpret antitrust in general. And, you know, we also have a great appointment at the Department of Justice, a guy named Jonathan Cantor. Again, he has been someone who has been fighting for anti-monopoly, fighting corporate power for all of his career. He is not out of the mold of the typical revolving door. And we now have a major lawsuit that he's brought to break up Google. And we're expecting the Federal Trade Commission to bring a lawsuit to break up Amazon, to break up these companies, which is really the core way that we deal with their power. So I just want to sort of say, we are at this moment, and it's so crucial that people pay attention and also step up. Like when the merger guidelines come out, there will be a public comment period. Members of Congress need to hear from ordinary people, especially in rural areas, saying, I like what the Federal Trade Commission is doing, because we've got big companies coming in and trying to get Congress to you know, push back against what the Federal Trade Commission is doing. So I totally agree with Beth, with your assessment of the way things have typically worked. For a number of reasons, we've had a break. This sort of unusual set of things have come together, and I can't sort of underscore how much I think we need to seize this opportunity. I think we have a chance to set antitrust on a different pathway for the long term, not only with Biden, but through future administrations. And I think that could have huge implications, beneficial.
I was thinking of folks like Vilsack, who's in a position, and he comes out of a corporate background, and a lot of the Secretary of the Treasuries have been bank executives. I can't think, and heads of like the FCC came out of the like Verizon type. So that's what I was getting at. What you're talking about is very, very interesting, but there's so many other departments that are being headed by folks who came out of corporation jobs. So that's what I was getting at.
I think
absolutely. And we just to say one more thing, we talked about Vilsack. I completely agree with that criticism, and there are others as well. But I also want to say when we sort of concede and don't like run with the opportunities, like we're doing them a favor, you know, right? We're doing the powers that be a favor. And so, I mean, that's why as I said, I really think, you know, one of our biggest, I think the biggest challenge we face in trying to shift these issues is a sense that it can't change, and the apathy that leads to, and that the corporations have too much power. And so as an advocate, and I want to invite all of you to join me in this stance, I really feel like it's like my job to constantly point to, here is a big opening. We need to go, like we need to take this and not concede the idea that we can't get there.
Thank you. And I'm gonna sort of combine a couple of questions here and make a little comment myself and then turn it to Stacy. So Susan has asked a couple of times, what can we do? What can we, the individual? Mike has brought up the question in his about whether or not talking about antitrust, anti-monopoly provides a political advantage for liberals, progressives, Democrats. And I'm gonna put those two together with what Beth was saying, that it's, first of all, there is pretty strong evidence that candidates who are relentlessly pro-small business and anti-big monopoly businesses or excess corporate control, they do infinitely better than candidates who don't address that or are wishy-washy about those issues on everything from surveys that are taken by voters to even the results. So some of Ruby's own candidate analysis helped to verify that. So I do think there is political advantage to it. I also would say that all of us on the political side, pushing our elected representatives and potential candidates to make these issues central. The lifting up of small, independent, diverse businesses, small manufacturers, and fighting monopolies. That's what we have to do, because, to be honest, Democrats and liberals have not made that central to our message and still don't today. So I do think that when we do that, we not only score some points, but it's a way to begin to rebuild trust with rural and working class people who, as a group, do not like the fact that a few corporations dominate so much of their lives and the economy. So I do think there's clear evidence that this is the way to go. But I'll go back to you for that, Stacy. What do you think about this kind of twofold question? Mike's about whether or not this helps from a political point of view. Are there examples of that? And then Susan's question of just kind of in general, what can we do to address these problems?
Yeah, it's really, I'd love to see some of the candidate analysis that Ruby has done. We've seen the same thing, and I think there's, there's really good polling from Pew and elsewhere showing that there is vast support for anti-monopoly, pro-small business, checking corporate power across America, and it is as strong among conservative voters as it is among liberal voters, and so there is within that lies an opportunity for the party that steps up to lead on those issues. We could begin to imagine if a party can really deliver on taking those things on, not only in its messaging, but in terms of what it actually does, might we get past this sort of 50-50 logjam? Might we get to a point where we start to have majorities that a party can take and really govern with? But that requires, I think, really pushing on Democrats and Republicans. I invite both parties to take that mantle, not to be the party of big business and to actually step up and deliver. And we have not seen that the way that we should. But it is winning politics, and it's especially so in rural America. I think there's a very, some of the worst harms of corporate concentration. We talked about this some with the dollar store, but this is true, whether it's the consolidation in hospitals and the loss of access to healthcare, or rising drug prices, or the lack of affordable food in grocery stores. There are so many ways in which we are seeing communities that have been marginalized by concentrated corporate power, that are both rural communities and communities of color in cities. And those parallels, it really strikes me, therein lies a political alliance that could begin to shift things in a big way by recognizing that common cause. So I think that that's absolutely right. In terms of what it is that we can do, I mentioned a few things. I know, as I said, the merger guidelines sound really wonky, but they are a pivotal part of this, and there's going to be a public comment period. If you want to kind of keep up with what's going on in that, we have a newsletter we send out about once a month or once every 3 weeks. That's a good way. We'll notify you when that's happening, and other sort of public comment opportunities around what the agencies are doing, what the Biden administration is doing. I also think it's important to engage with elected officials, certainly members of Congress. Especially we're hoping to have this be part of the discussions that go on around the election. Like, how much can we make this set of issues part of all the various races that are going on across the country? And would love to think with Ruby and others about how to do that. And then I would also say that there has been, because of the loss of local newspapers, a lot of which has been driven by the fact that Facebook and Google are the gatekeepers, and they take a lot of the ad revenue that should be going with the content that local news outlets produce. Because of that shrinking of local newspapers and disappearance of local newspapers, there hasn't been the kind of reporting on this set of issues, or reporting on what could change, what is happening in the administration, in a way that can really help a broader set of people get engaged on these issues. And so the other thing I would invite you to do is to think about what in your community, where are there conversations going on that you can introduce some of this, Is there a way to talk to someone, letter to the editor, or talk to a local reporter editor about covering some of these issues, like some of the ways in which the ban on non-competes, or addressing mergers, monopoly power in general, would benefit your local community. So just would invite you to kind of think about how you can help generate this conversation, because I don't think there's nearly enough of it going on.
Including letters to the editor and those sorts of things as well. It doesn't get talked about in the little bit of local media that's left. So we're almost at time, but we still have several questions in the chat, and Barbara has her hand raised. So I'm gonna ask Barbara, and be as brief as you can, Barbara, because we want to also then get to at least two other, maybe three other questions in the chat. Go ahead, Barbara.
Been excellent discussion. Thank you. I just want to point out that it seems to me that you have a lot of facts, which is great, and that needs to be presented. But when we actually come to trying to get people to say, look, this candidate is the candidate that is going to help you, they go to the Walmarts, they go to the Dollar Trees, they go to this because they see better prices or things that benefit them. We're really going to have to get down to these kitchen table issues of how this is really going to give them a better life and affect their own personal economy. And how can we do that is my question.
That's a great question, Barbara. And maybe if I could add one piece to it, Stacy, to give you a twofold. Sometimes when you speak out against Walmart, Dollar Tree, et cetera, you can be accused of being an elitist. Like, well, you can afford to go to Whole Foods, but most of us can't. So maybe address Barbara's question first and see if that other is an element as well.
We did an event about a month ago in May. It was a virtual event, so you can watch it. It was called "Fixing the Food Gap," and I raise it because we brought together a set of folks who are working at the local level to try to stop dollar chains from overrunning their communities. In one case, we had a community that hadn't had a grocery store in 14 years and now has a new locally owned grocery store. So we had a range of folks who are on the ground actually dealing with the fallout from Walmart's market power, from the concentration in the food system, talking about what they're doing locally. And we also had one of the FTC commissioners, Alvaro Bedoya, on that event. And it was we had a great turnout, and it was a really wonderful conversation that ground this set of sort of enforcement issues, the way in which Walmart and Dollar General essentially squeeze suppliers and demand lower prices that are not available to competing independent grocers, which is a violation of the law, but we don't enforce it. We had a really wonderful conversation and a sort of event, really grounding this in actual communities. Here's what the effects are on the ground. And these are mostly low-income communities that we had represented. They are really, low-income communities are really hurt by all of this far more than certainly well-off communities are. And so we are certainly in our work, think that I couldn't agree more about the need to discuss all of this and to situate all of this in real conversations that are happening around the kitchen table, that are happening around Main Street. And we've been sort of trying to do that in a number of different ways. And so, yes, I 100% agree with that. I will say, like, it's also one of the things that we're, that is one of the consequences of the last 40 years of this sort of Chicago school of thinking that's so focused on the consumer and prices and so on, is that it has led to our we conceive of ourselves as consumers, right? Like, that's how we think of ourselves first and foremost. And our notion of ourselves as citizens, as stewards of a community, has really atrophied in a lot of ways. So whenever people are presented with a problem, often our first response is, what should I do as a consumer? Where should I shop or not shop? Becomes the way, should I stop shopping at Amazon? Should I not go to Walmart? And our message really is, yes, your local businesses need you. If you can make other choices, great, but that's really not the issue. The issue is that we have a set of laws, a set of policies that have worked to tilt the playing field. And what we really want people to do is to step up as a citizen, not try to sacrifice or to try to do things that are difficult for you or that you may not be able to do given your circumstances, but really to be there as a citizen calling for a level playing field. And that's, I think, what's gonna lead to change.
Okay, I'm going to do one more combined question. Thanks for folks for sticking with it a little past the hour, and thanks especially to Stacy. I'll mention that Cynthia Wallace, who's a partner of Ruby, mentions that it would be really, really important and essential to be able to talk about this critical issue in as plain language as possible. So I think that's something that Ruby works on a lot, is plain language, but I would also suggest that people might want to go to the ILSR website, and there's probably some of that plain language there. But let's make this the final question. It's two sides of the same coin. Tess and then Lon. Tess has asked what the chances are of these actions. You referred to a few different actions that the FTC and maybe the Justice Department have begun to take to try to roll back some of this concentration, to begin to, to prevent the non-competes. You talked about several different things. So her question was, what are the chances that they succeed? And then Lon threw in the somewhat pessimistic but realistic comment that won't any progress we make in this way simply be undone by the Supreme Court?
Yeah. Yes. So let me say one thing about the previous question, and then I'm going to go into that. I would be very remiss, and I should have thought to mention this. We do a podcast, and this last season, which we're just wrapping up now, was the whole season we called Frontline Stories in the Fight Against Monopoly Power, and Jackie has kindly put the link in here. If you want to introduce people to these issues or even just understand them a bit more yourselves, it's a great way to do it. And it really does what Barbara talks about. It's through the voices of real people, and then combined with some policy experts. So really connecting, what does this mean at the kitchen table? What does this mean on Main Street? And then what is the policy that it's connected to? And our Reggie and Luke on our team who do the podcast, I think, did an amazing job of really doing that. So would highly recommend this last season. The podcast is called Building Local Power, and you can get it wherever you get podcasts. And there's also a link in the chat. And then onto this question of like, what are the chances this is all going to evaporate in a new administration or at the hands of the Supreme Court? It's a great question. It is one of the reasons that it's important to note that conservative voters are as adamant in support of anti-monopoly as liberal voters are. It's actually, according to Pew polling on questions around the power of big tech and Amazon and so on, it is identical. And that's interesting. It makes the politics of this issue different than a lot of other issues and maybe opens up a really hopeful avenue. It's worth noting, and we're in a different world now, but there was a broad consensus on antitrust, both in that New Deal period, it was supported by a lot of conservatives, and in that sort of Borkian Reagan period where we had a lot of liberals who supported the sort of pro-bigness approach as well. And so there is a real possibility that we could end up on a path where there was some variation in the parties, but both of them were more committed to the idea of checking corporate power. We obviously are in new terrain in our politics, and so it's hard to know exactly how that might play out. I think the most important strategies that we have right now for ensuring that new direction is durable, there are two. One is that we need anti-monopoly to be embedded in the political agenda, the policy agenda of as many constituencies and stakeholders as we can. And so we've been working really hard with small business. So we've built a network of 40 small business organizations representing about 250,000 small businesses who have made antitrust invigoration a key part of their policy agenda. And that is something that I think will endure over the long term. And they're all over the country. They have a certain amount of political reach. We're also seeing unions step up, like the Teamsters, and become much more outspoken on these issues. Farm groups. I mean, essentially, we need everyone to make this part of what they're demanding from both parties. That's part of the staying power. And then the other piece is that we're working really hard to resurrect the laws, the statutes as they're written by Congress, and the legislative history around them. Because it is hard, you cannot read these laws and what they say and what Congress said when they passed them, and then look at what the court decisions have been those two things don't make any sense. And so as we recover those laws and really lift up what Congress did and why it did it, it bolsters the political case for change. It bolsters what the FTC and the DOJ are trying to do in terms of using those laws as they were intended. And it gives us a pathway to begin to change case law, which is the law that is made by the courts. And so that process can take time, but it's a process that I hope and believe that we're on, not only by dusting off the laws and bringing, seeing the agencies bring the kind of cases that can shape how courts think about antitrust, and the academics doing their good work and all of the things that are underway. But I would also just note that the generation of folks who are in law schools now, who've been influenced by people like Lena Khan, are a very different set of folks with a very different way of understanding monopoly issues than we saw even 10 years ago. And so I'm also hopeful about the new generation of folks that are going to eventually come into antitrust and into the agencies and into this whole kind of body of thinking.
Thank you. That's great. And another resource I'll mention to folks is Matt Stoller's book on monopoly in the
Goliath, yeah.
Goliath. And he goes into great detail to show what the original early legislation said, specifically about why we needed antitrust legislation, to see what that was so clear, as you said, and then to see how, starting with Bork and others, it was completely reinterpreted, to put it nicely, is mind altering for sure. So thanks to everybody for being on the call. This really is an area of hope within the current administration. And as Stacy has said, even going beyond that to the folks who are coming out of law school now with a new and more authentic view of this. Stacy, thank you again for being our presenter this month on Ruby's briefing. Your work with the Institute of Local Self-Reliance goes beyond this anti-monopoly and includes working directly with local communities to build up the base of their small, diverse businesses. So don't, please, everybody, go check out ILSR. And if you're trying to strengthen the diversity and the local ownership in your economy, you'll find a lot of resources there as well. So thanks to Stacy, thanks to all of you. Next month, Heidi Binko, the director of the Just Transition Fund, will be our presenter, and she'll be talking about some really exciting initiatives all around Appalachia and other parts of the country where they were formerly dependent on coal mining for the economy, and the new non-coal economies that are emerging, some very exciting stuff. So I hope you'll join us next month as well. Y'all take care.
Thanks. Bye.